Thank you very much, Allison. It's a pleasure to be here. Yes, I've looked up to Allison for basically my entire adult life, and so it's absolutely a dream come true to come here and share my research with all of you. I am the PI and director of the Cognitive Optimization and Relational Robotics Laboratory at Georgia Tech, where we are trying to enable robots to work in the hands of everyday end users, relaxing a lot of the assumptions we make about those interactions so we can really automate the job of the roboticist, so to get myself out of the end user robot loop. Why might we want to do that? Here's a graphic where on the horizontal axis you're going to see years, where we're actually very much towards the far right of this graph. And the vertical axis on the left, you're going to see the number of full-time equivalents of registered nurses, and on the right, the average age of the population in the United States. Unfortunately, what we find is that the minimum standards for a government agency, HSRA, supply requirements for nursing is outstripping the availability of nurses. That's the minimum standards. That's not actually what we really need to take care of everyone. And if you look at this graphic, for example, out of North Carolina, we are already approaching this linear decline that's going to go on in perpetuity unless something changes. So we're going to have a drastically insufficient number of healthcare professionals to take care of our aging population. Not only are older people requiring more care intervention, but also that means that there are fewer young people who can also be in the population to take care of them. We are working as a part of the AI Caring Institute, NSF funded at Georgia Tech. The program director is Sonia Chernova. And we're working with the Cognitive Empowerment Program at Emory University to look at how we might be able to use technology, deploy robots or smart home technology to enable the individuals with mild cognitive impairment who ultimately might have dementia to stay in their home as long as possible, to have some autonomy, some dignity before they might have to go to an acute care facility. These individuals slowly lose their capabilities and retreat from society in a very sad way, and we just don't have the resources to take care of them. And so our long-term goal is to actually have these robots be able to be deployed by care partners, adult children, or spouses who are still fully cognitively intact, who could help program these robots to perform everything from taking out the trash to delivering proper medicine, to actually developing models of your behavior so that they could identify if you might have had a stroke or have some other decline that might warrant and benefit from medical intervention. The challenges are also in manufacturing. With our aging population, unfortunately, the US is slipping in our manufacturing output, and that our population and the skill set that we have is not keeping up. And we need robotic systems that are going to enable our work in cyber manufacturing, which I recently have a grant on with some of my colleagues at Georgia Tech, and kind of focusing American manufacturing on made-to-order custom parts that can be efficiently, cheaply made for you. Unfortunately, most of that work has to be done manually now because it's one-offs. But if we can actually have general-purpose robotic systems that can learn and adapt on the fly without needing somebody in C++ to come and rewrite the robot software every time a part changes, then maybe we would able to realize this kind of made-to-order cyber manufacturing future. So how are we going to do this? How are we going to have robots actually deployed en masse around the world? Are we going to have hand-derived controllers? As one of my colleagues, Professor Seth Hutchinson, likes to say, why don't I just pay one of my grad students to do it? Why do you actually need your reinforcement learning algorithms? Well, I don't think there's enough grad students to go around solving every problem that robots are going to have in the future. It's also very challenging. We've evolved over tens of thousands of years to be very amazing at performing a great variety of tasks to close the loop between perception, decision-making, and action. And we often find it difficult to articulate that into a program that would enable a robot to work. That's why, for example, we use deep neural networks for computer vision rather than a decision tree. We could also just think about pure reinforcement learning. We've tried that. We've tried ARM farms, and they have had some impressive successes. But ultimately, the amount of resources that you need to invest into reinforcement learning, because it's a lack of sample efficiency, how long it takes to learn it, and just for a very single task with a very clearly defined and perhaps shaped reward function, that's also not really a scalable approach. So I argue we need to bring the human into the loop, leverage what humans are good at, being able to quickly learn, adapt, create, teach, disseminate knowledge, and enable the right robot techniques, the right formulations of artificial intelligence and machine learning and explainable AI, so that these systems can collaborate with you and you can customize their behavior for whatever application you need. What am I specifically saying when I talk about learning from humans? Let's say learning from demonstration, LFD, is going to take as input a Markov decision process without a known reward function. We're going to have a set of states of the world, say, in a healthcare environment, we can describe the state of the world as where all the patients are. In obstetrics and gynecology, we can describe their gestational age, how many children they've delivered before, if they've had any kind of anesthetic applied, or other medications or comorbidities. It's really kind of a POMDP, but we're going to ignore that for a moment. We can have actions. If you're a charge nurse, this is at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, Massachusetts, this single charge nurse has to basically be an air traffic controller deciding which of something in the order of 30 nurses and scrub techs are going to have to take care of which patients, when, where, and route everyone through so that everyone, all the mothers delivering, have the right resources at the right time so that nothing goes wrong. And she currently doesn't have any decision support, and they're literally using a whiteboard with rows and columns where people write in the information and update it as you go. So she can make those decisions about resource management, who should take care of what, when, where, and how. And then we want to learn from her policy, pi star, that's going to map the state of the world to the action that she would take for managing these resources and labor delivery, and minimize some measure of divergence or difference between what the robot would guess the human would do, pi of s, and then what the human pi star of s would do. And then whether we take the expectation over the distribution of states induced by the teacher versus the learner gets us whether we're talking about behavior cloning or imitation learning, if you're familiar with those concepts. And so in some of my prior work, we actually did this to provide decision support for nurses. Now, why would I want decision support for nurses? Well, it's an incredibly stressful job, and as I'll show you later, their decision making is actually impacted by workload. Their decision making might deteriorate in high workload, high stress situations. So if you can actually learn from experts in nominal conditions, perhaps you could provide decision support for them or play a devil's advocate role when things get more stressful. There's also a lot of work by Maya Matarich that I would point you to for why we want something embodied. Ultimately, I want this robot to be physically useful as well. But in the meantime, there's actually a lot of cognitive benefits and the psychosocial aspects of trust, reliance, and compliance on this technology that can be that we can modulate through an actual embodied anthropomorphic form. So why should RL researchers care about learning from demonstration? Let's just do it RL. Well, first, many great feats of reinforcement learning are precipitated because of learning from humans. The original AlphaGo relied on a backbone of supervised learning to get it to work. And there's actually one sentence in that paper, if you go and read it, that says why this might be the case, that we needed to use a human supervised learning model as the backbone instead of RL. It said maybe something about humans can explore the space better. And it's just like one sentence on it. Of course, they had RL built on top of it, and then ultimately they solved it without the need of humans. Recently, there's Gato that came out as pure supervised learning. Maybe in a few years, once we've now kind of figured out how to do this with imitation learning, maybe one day we'll figure out how to do it with RL from scratch. Second, LFD can be used to distill engineering controllers for bootstrapping RL. So Byron Boots, Panos Tsiotras, and Evangelos Theodorou have been doing a lot of work where you can actually design MPC controllers, or other mechanisms from control theory and actually have a neural network imitate the controller and then do RL on top of that to exceed the ability of the engineer to hand specify a controller. It's a pretty cool idea. And then thirdly, work with Peter Beal on Dragon has looked at say, digital cooking environments in which a human and an AI would work together to coordinate activities to bake items. And you can actually think about the challenge that it would be to train an RL agent from scratch with a human. I don't know if anyone in this room would live long enough to provide all the samples needed for an RL agent to learn something complicated. But what if you could have two people playing together and you could learn with imitation learning a model of that human and use, and basically in a dream state, offline, have an RL agent work an infinite amount of time with that model of a human, and then be able to deploy that RL agent in the real world. They've shown some promise for that. And why not? Because humans are amazing. We should want to learn from them. We can jump from space. We can separate conjoined twins without ever having done that before. That specific case of conjoined twins. And we can fly like Iron Man, almost. But humans also have failings. We have biases. So this video is not fake. But you've probably never seen it before. And this is not just people trying to make fun of astronauts or create a hoax for the moon landing. The moon landing really did happen. I was there. So you have a gravity sensor in your head. The otolith organs will tell you where down is. It can actually get messed up when you are in high G situations. It used to be that pilots launching off of aircraft carriers would, when they're thrown back from the G forces, their otolith organ would slide to the back of their head, and they would think that they're looking up. And then right off they go to the carrier, they pitch the nose down and fly right into the ocean. So they had to change the rules, and you'll see videos of the pilots holding onto a handlebar up in their cockpit. They're not allowed to touch their joystick until they actually get airborne because of that. And when you're on the moon, the gravity is so small, your otolith organ doesn't work right. So you're only working on your visual system. And if you're walking on the side of a hill, your eyes tell your brain that you are sideways, and you need to orient yourself perpendicular to the surface of the hill. And then there's just enough gravity that you will fall over. And your brain can't figure it out. So it's pretty funny. But we still went to the moon, and the astronauts still figured out how to get around enough. I think they even maybe hit a golf ball. So there are these limitations physically. There's also cognitive biases that we have. Many of us have probably experienced that algorithm or that paper we just can't figure out, and it's a sunken cost fallacy, but we have to get it to work. There's no way I spent this much time on this paper to fail. There's confirmation bias that we often experience when we want to try to see if we're right or wrong about an idea that we have. And these I know that Professor Dursa Sadiq has also looked at these issues of bounded rationality that limit and actually benefit us in living in this world. But I think a lot of machine learning researchers want to just think of humans as spherical, just like physicists joke about the spherical cow. And I'd also say that a lot of people, perhaps in the machine learning community, because we need so many samples for these models to work, we're just going to farm it out on mTurk or Prolific, which we do that research too because we need lots of data. But I think we forget that humans aren't just these soulless, mindless automata, or in this case, necrons. If anyone knows what this is, come talk to me afterwards. Yes, good. They sold their souls to be able to, do well. So we're not this. And when researchers treat us like that, this is what happens. You end up with a guy wanting to watch Winnie the Pooh in his Tesla and not pay attention, and he dies. You have aircraft autopilot systems that are so complex and unfortunately brittle and misunderstand the state of the world that people die. We have NASA rover planners who still reject the decision-making of autonomous planners when it comes to science activities on Mars. They will allow these systems to kind of have fun when nothing matters. But when you actually need to drive up to a science target and do real science on Mars, that's still done by humans. And then surgeons are notorious for rejecting systems developed by engineers who are trying to help, but we end up solving the wrong problems. And I argue that autonomy fails to live up to its potential because researchers fail to understand the human and human autonomy interaction. So in my vision, I want robots to be able to deploy it. In this case, we did work with Boeing for manufacturing their 777, in national security environments, in healthcare, and in exploring space. I want us to have an R2-D2. There's no roboticist there fixing the ROS node in the back end there. Luke and R2-D2 are working together. They understand each other. They develop shared mental models, can anticipate each other's needs, and not have to communicate everything to each other. So we're going to do this in my lab by first giving robots insights into human decision-making through learning from demonstration and human subject experiments. We're going to then close that loop through explainable artificial intelligence to enable humans to understand what the robot has learned, or even teach the human how to be a better teacher of robots. And then we want to scale it up to coordinated reasoning of heterogeneous teams of humans and machines, because not all humans are alike. We need to account for the inherent weaknesses and strengths of each individual member of a team. I'm going to focus today on the closed loop, though, and think about why, again, do we need imitation learning? Why can't I just ask an expert, how do you be an amazing fighter pilot? I'm going to write all that down and then put it in a drone, and then I have my fighter pilot in a box. That doesn't work because experts can give you what they think, but not how they think about it. And actually, the worst thing you could ever do to an expert while they're doing something is ask them, how are you doing what you're doing? So if you're ever going to do a tandem jump and the person's doing their checklist to keep you safe, don't interrupt them. There was a really good article by Bilovich et al. In 2008 that looked at expert chess players, set them up to win a checkmate in a 3-move sequence, but they changed something about the board, said that 3-move sequence wouldn't work anymore. And you need to find a 4 or 5-move sequence, and they said, find it. And think out loud as you're doing it. The experts would say that I'm searching for novel options all across the board. But if you actually watch their eyes were looking at the same 3-move sequence over and over again. There was a disconnect between what they thought they were doing and what they were actually doing. There's also the Einstein effect. It's roughly German for habit, that experts, part of what makes you good is that you commit to muscle memory and habituate your decision making, and you have a hard time thinking outside of the box. So I've seen this firsthand in decision making of nurses, working with Julie Shaw at MIT, Neil Shaw and Tony Golin at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in our work deploying a robot there, that nurses' decision making is a function of patients, the number of patients in the labor and delivery floor, at least in our gaming environment. We didn't actually close the loop on robot. We didn't execute the robot actions in the real environment. We just offered suggestions. So we developed a game to explore this. And that for every additional patient in waiting, a logistic regression showed us that we had a 47% increased chance of a nurse recommending that a patient, a mother, an expecting mother, go out for dinner and come back later. That's an okay thing because it's not fun to hang out in a hospital forever, but should that really be a function of the nurse's workload? Maybe not. More frankly, it's clear that increasing workload on labor and delivery, x-axis, the number of patients in the waiting room that the nurse has to triage, results in increased delays for patients transferring off the waiting room, transferring off the floor, starting their C-section, and getting triaged. And so we can't just think of humans as these spherical cows that are invariant to everything. Humans do often provide suboptimal demonstrations, adopting heuristics because of the complexities of life. And much of LFD work still makes strong assumptions on the demonstration optimality, that humans are always giving you the perfect state action pair that the robot just needs to imitate. And there's been a lot of great work in preference-based reinforcement learning. I'd say that Dorsa is probably the world leader in that topic at the moment. And so it's awesome to be here and also scary to say this in front of you. Requires soliciting an abundance of human preferences over trajectories, a high cost, and there's an error-prone process. Although Dorsa work has done a lot to make that much more sample efficient as well. And so I'm going to introduce something called the noise-performance relationship, which came out of Scott Neekum and Daniel Brown working together on something called T-Rex, yes, like the dinosaur. And let's look at the half-cheetah domain. It's a 2D plane where this half-cheetah thing tries to run as fast as possible. Let's add, so mix to the robot's policy, pi, some amount eta of noise to all of its joints, so it kind of shakes as it moves with this uniform distribution. And so we're going to have a state action trajectory with some noise added to that tuple. And the more noise we add, the worse the robot's behavior gets. But how much worse is it actually getting? Well, because there's a built-in reward function for this, we can actually compute that reward, get an actual number for it, and then plot it on this axis and see that it's something like the right-hand side of a sigmoid. Maybe it's an exponential decay. Well, what's interesting is that if we could figure out the relationship between the amount of noise that we add to a robot's execution of a policy, if that's our behavior cloning version of what we learned from a human, or somewhere along here, then maybe we could extrapolate what negative noise kind of might look like, even though that doesn't really make any sense. But that's kind of what we're going to do. So prior work, DREX, looked at automatically generating rank trajectories through this noise performance relationship. So first doing imitation learning and then doing rollouts and adding increasing amounts of noise, and then using a loose shepherd rule to end up figuring out how to figure out some interval ranking or ordinal ranking to these trajectories. There's a couple of drawbacks. It used behavior cloning, which does suffer from covariate shift, and although it is a very highly practical mode of learning where it's simply supervised learning, so we learn a policy to map states to actions. And I think I heard from somebody that we're now going to have a paper, maybe it already exists, called All You Need Is Behavior Cloning. There's like all you need is diversity, all you need is attention, maybe there's all you need is behavior cloning. The other issue is that the loose shepherd rule also is not quite adaptive to the individual domain or task that you're trying to learn. And that if you set it up with 3 specific trajectories and you try to figure out what the reward would be, you would find that it should be like the geometric mean of the 2 around it in this case. And so it's generally homogeneous across the tasks. And so we want to learn some way to characterize this noise performance relationship that is responsive to the specific algorithm that's being learning on in the task at hand. And so we tried to characterize this in a Coral paper. This was by one of my students, Lei Tian Chen. We looked at a number of OpenAI gym environments, mountain car, pendulum, et cetera. And on the x-axis, the amount of noise you have, and the y-axis is a normalized amount of the reward that you would accrue when you have an A to C reinforcement learning algorithm trained to optimality. And we're just going to degrade it and see how much worse it gets as you add noise to the rollouts. We'll do this for PPO and soft vector critic. And we found that it's not homogeneous. There's actually, it's a function of the RL algorithm, so the style of the execution, and also the specific task at hand. And if you fit the loose shepherd rule, it doesn't have the capacity to appreciate this. And so instead, if you fit a sigmoid to the actual data points, you can explain a lot of the variance with just a few parameters of the sigmoid. So that's what we're going to exploit. So we're going to start with an adversarial inverse reinforcement learning setup. We're going to take demonstrations from the human, a set of trajectories, which are a sequence of state action pairs for how a robot's going to perform the task, or in this case, the human's doing it. And then we're going to try to learn a policy that takes the same states from those demos, or its own states, predicts the action the human would take, and then we're going to compare the synthetic action versus the real action through a discriminator that has within it an estimate of the reward function that it learns to predict if it's coming from the human, real, or if it's coming from the robot, fake. Once we've learned the reward function, we can extract the reward function out of the discriminator itself, and we get the policy. This should now be able to parrot what the human did. And this should be able to guess how good it was as a function of the trajectory of the specific rollout. And so we're going to add noise to a number of rollouts of this policy we have to parrot the person, thinking that the more noise we add, it should get worse. And then we're going to get the reward function we learned to give us an initial guess for what the quality of that demonstration, the robot's behavior was when you add a certain amount of noise to it. That will give us a scatter plot. We'll then regress a sigmoid function to it. and then we're going to go back and force the reward function to then fit the sigmoid. So the sigmoid here is basically going to act like a low-pass filter or a way to help us distill something that generalizes the reward function better from the person. So we can ask the robot what is better than what the human showed without ever having to ask the human what is better. We also try to improve the robustness of our initial reward that we're learning. Because we're adding all of these noisy trajectories, those are very different than what the human demonstrated. And if we overfit our discriminator, our reward function, to think about these noisy trajectories, that might induce this misalignment of what we actually care about. And so we're going to do this kind of importance resampling where we kind of flip the importance of the likelihood that the human took it, measure that relative to the likelihood that we'll get it from a noisy policy, to make sure that we have the expectation over what we care about. We compare this to DREX. So the full DREX algorithm is on the far right using behavior cloning with the Luce-Shepard rule for learning. And then we use noisy ARL with self-supervised reward regression. And across a number of simulated domains, we were able to find a high correlation between the ground truth reward function, which the environment has built in, and then what we were able to infer. And that both as an ablation, the noisy AIRL component does better than AIRL, which does better than behavior cloning. And this is the reward function that we learned. And that you can see in blue here, those are the synthetic trajectories that we're able to learn from, that we create. Blue are holdout data points that are testing, and then red is the single example that we learned from the person. And so we're able to improve over prior work, particularly in that change from the blue to the green dots for generalization. And then if you have the reward function, now we can actually synthesize a controller, a reinforcement learning controller against that to outperform the initial demonstration quality that we got. We deployed this in table tennis because it's fun and it's easier than real tennis. And we looked at metrics for our demonstration of the lateral speed, how fast the ball is moving down this way, how fast it's moving falling after it goes down the net, which is a proxy for topspin, and then the estimated reward we get from self-supervised reward regression. And then we compare that to ARL, which should basically just mimic what the person did. And then self-supervised reward regression was able to learn to hit the ball faster with more spin without ever having to ask, in this case, Rohan Palaja, what better was. It automatically figured that out. So that's really exciting for us. I'll note that I have a rule in my lab that all the students should be wearing shoes. He's not. I don't condone being barefoot around robots. But maybe Sawyer's not so bad. All right. We can do more, though, to characterize specifically an individual person's suboptimality. And there's another flavor of learning from demonstration algorithms known as Dagger, which has you teach the robot while the robot is trying to perform the task. So we're going to imagine a car driving itself, and you're sitting in the front driver's seat, and you're trying to steer the robot to go in the right direction, but the robot basically ignores you until after it's over, and then it learns from all the feedback that you gave it as you're trying to fight it. That's kind of a difficult way to learn from. And so researchers have said, behavior cloning is all you need. Maybe it's easier, but Dagger is really nice because it kind of alleviates this covariate shift issue and has more nice statistical properties for that learning. So you're basically learning from, you're learning corrections from mistakes, which is kind of a nice mathematical framework, but it doesn't really set up people well to provide the demonstrations. So people are suboptimal here. Well, what if we could characterize how the person is suboptimal and then add that, whatever that error is, in this case, perhaps the person over or undercorrects or is anticipatory or delayed in their feedback while they're trying to steer the car to teach the car how to drive through an obstacle course. If we can characterize how they're wrong, then maybe we can fix that on their demonstrations for a new task and then better provide training data for Dagger to learn the desired task. And so if we assume we have a set of calibration tasks where we have the ground truth optimal trajectory where the robot should go, We can then have the person give their corrective feedback for the robot suboptimally performing that task as though it's still trying to learn. We can measure how off the person is from what the optimal feedback should have been. We use variational inference for mutual information maximization between an embedding and the person's actions to capture that kind of characterization of the person's suboptimality. And we developed an approach, mind meld. I'm a huge Star Trek nerd, live long and prosper. And within this embedding space, we can actually see overcorrectors who are delayed, overcorrectors who are anticipatory, kind of characterized by these the colors, and then the magnitude of it is the size of those colors. And then we can kind of learn to rank them in their quartiles for how poor their feedback is. And we actually showed in a recent paper that came out in HRI 2022 this year that Mariah Schrum and Aaron Headland showed that we could improve the data that we give to Dagger to learn from, so that Dagger now actually learns better than either vanilla Dagger or behavior cloning by learning to basically correct for the human's feedback on a novel task. I said that I was going to close the loop. It's not just humans teaching robots, or even robots characterizing human teaching, but now we want to actually make humans better teachers. And Mariah and Aaron continued this work in a paper that they're going to now present in New Zealand. So I'm very happy for them to get to go fight some urukai there. That in our first study, so this was the same mind meld setup where you're teaching a car to drive through an obstacle course. We're going to characterize their suboptimality. And then we're going to, in that embedding space, if we annotate it, so we actually have to give it semantically meaningful dimensions in this embedding space, that's our limitation, we tell them, hey, you're actually overcorrecting. Maybe do less of that. And we modulate that by how significant their over or undercorrecting and their temporal offset is. And we showed first that we can modify your behavior and how you teach the robot. So we can kind of induce you to move around in this suboptimal embedding space. Second, we looked at, is it best to tell people all the ways in which they're wrong, or just pick the worst way? And characterize kind of design from a user's perspective. It's actually useful to give people multiple, to actually tell people all the way in which they're wrong. But I know that sounds horrible to say out loud. But that is a useful thing to think about. And then finally, is it actually going to make people better in the long run? So if we don't have calibration tasks now because we've made people change their behavior because we provided feedback through multiple rounds of training the human to be a better teacher on a novel task where the robot doesn't know what the ground truth is, and I've changed the person's behavior, can I use a neural network, specifically an LSTM architecture, to predict where you should now be in this embedding space? Hopefully it's near optimal, but I don't know. Maybe you've wandered off in the wrong direction. Can I figure out where you are now because of my impact on you as a robot, teaching you as a human, and still correct for your suboptimality now and provide a better training signal for Dagger? And we showed that, yes, in fact, we can still figure out how we are changing people well enough to be able to characterize them and close this loop and improve the human-machine team. I also like to have my students not just try to make people better, but try to make people worse, because there's an important confound when you're looking at adaptive systems that you need an adaptive baseline. And what better than adaptive baseline than actually showing you can control people in every dimension? This is another kind of issue with running actual human-centered experiments. So we can actually make you better or worse in the feedback you give. I want to start bridging now to think about more complex setups than these low-level skills for short-term trajectories. And some of our work that came out in Andrew Silva looked at now how do we bring in language to learning from different tasks where prior work, up until very recently, most people have been looking at multitask settings where robots are going to do tabletop manipulation tasks, opening, closing windows, opening, closing drawers, maybe picking up balls, pick up and place objects. So we have a variety of tasks within MetaWorld, developed Chelsea Finn, and Peter, Bill, and others were working on that, developed MT10 and then MT50. And we had this idea, maybe all the great work that's being done in NLP and starting to look at multitask learning, maybe we can start doing that with learning from demonstration. And so there was contemporary work that was looking at this idea of using language to specify the task instead of using a one-hot encoding of the different tasks you want to do. In contemporary we showed that, and we also extended to the imitation learning case so that we can have people provide natural language and demonstrations to be able to, in a more sample efficient way, generalize to show new behaviors and more quickly learn, synthesize robot control policies for new behaviors just being guided by language. There is kind of an issue though when we work with large language models, as many of you know, that there are sometimes toxic contents in the data sets themselves, and then the models learn on that, and then the contents can kind of get a bit squirrely. You all maybe remember Microsoft Tay and some other, no, shaking of the head, okay. I'm getting older already. So there are issues, and so I was working with Andrew Hunt and some other researchers at the University of Washington that looked at the kind of the impact of when large language models meet robots, that there might be some important downstream impacts of that might have unintended consequences. So it's not a focus of my talk, but I'd refer you to our recent paper at FACT if you want to learn more, and I'm happy to talk to you about it offline. Ultimately, I want these systems deployed in the real world, whether it's in somebody's home or in a manufacturing environment. This is a picture of C-130. We had a project with Lockheed Martin. We were looking at drilling, riveting, fastening sections of their C-130 fuselage. And they have a lot of non-recurring engineering effort and made-to-order customizations that they might need to consider, particularly in commercial manufacturing. And so we looked at how robots could be taught by individual workers on the shop floor to without a CAD model of the part, develop such a virtual representation and then learn within that representation the skill set and modeling of the skills that the human wants the robot to perform. Often you have humans that are very skilled running around from fuselage to fuselage doing just these random odds and ends with each aircraft because the scale of it cannot justify spending inordinate immense amount of money to develop actual robotic solutions in the way we think about it for automotive manufacturing. And so we combine imitation and reinforcement learning here to be able to do this. It's actually really hard to put a peg in a hole with tight tolerances. And as we build to multi-tasks and now multi-step tasks, and our robots are going to be in the home and actually try to cook you a meal, we're going to have to think hierarchically and efficiently, because we don't want to teach a robot how to cook a meal by showing the entire meal and say, this is everything you need to cook French toast. No, I want it to learn how to crack an egg. I want it to learn how to get the egg out of the fridge or a general object out of the fridge, and then reuse those skills in a recipe so that I can compose it for arbitrary new skills in the future. That's going to make learning easier, and it's going to make the burden on me less significant as well. For robots to help people learn these novel tasks, we're going to have to develop learning from demonstration approaches that can handle long horizon, multimodal, multitask specifications. That generally falls within the vein of task and motion planning, where at the low level we have these kind of kinodynamic planning elements, and then we might have like PDL, like structures of shifts planning at something. At a hierarchical level, we have hierarchical task networks. And we wanted to know, can people teach robots with TAMP recipes? So I think a lot of people thought yes. There was an important work looking at keyframes by Eggun with Maya Chakmak about 10 years ago, that keyframes is kind of the idea that you could have, if a robot's going to pick up a cup off of a table, you could show like the basic key like waypoints along that trajectory. What we're going to find though is that in many of those setups, the humans are trained on how to provide the keyframes for the distribution of tasks that they're looking at. So then humans can kind of just parrot what they literally saw. Can humans actually generalize that to a different task to break it down in some hierarchical structure? And so far the answer is we're going to have a negative result. We actually had an RSS paper this summer with Nakul Gopalan, who's now an assistant professor at Arizona State University. And the paper was actually titled Negative Results in LFD. People in reinforcement learning try to break down problems. This is some of like Nakul's earlier work where you're wanting to look at trajectory segmentation or other ways of breaking up individual motor primitives and then hierarchically composing them. And then also people in cognitive science have tried to understand how we do this as well. And I'm going to be specific. When I talk about abstractions for, say, cooking, and yes, that does say manure, because we weren't going to use real food, and that's not real manure, it's just pretend manure, because we're going to create potting mixtures to create the right acidity or whatever for the soil that you want for the exotic plant that you're going to grow. So this is what I mean. You're not going to want to demonstrate the entire task for a robot. You're going to want to break it up. And then you're going to want to break it up at such a granular level that each little primitive can have some generalizability and can be composed in this hierarchical fashion. And we developed an abstraction score that was kind of shown qualitatively on the previous slide that looks at these different trajectories. And if you run them through dynamic movement primitives or other learning algorithms, that they really break down unless you actually get the abstraction hierarchy correct. So we asked, do people naturally teach with abstractions? What factors or inducements might elicit the abstraction-based teaching? And can you then be taught to give those abstractions? We did 2 experiments. First 28 participants, we had a baseline, which somebody shows up, here's the user interface, teach the robot how to mix these different elements into your soil for a given recipe on a day. And then we said, okay, how about for 3 different days, you're going to come up with 3 different mixtures. And then here, you're going to come up with 10 different mixtures, but they're all the same. Are you going to realize that you can actually do something like copy-paste or functional programming through your demonstrations? And then finally, we're going to just literally have written instructions for you. And then actually none of that worked, except for the written instructions. And so we said, what else could we do? Let's have our baseline in a second experiment, and then in one setting, we're going to have people teach with abstractions, have the robot, in a Wizard of Oz way, show you what the robot would have done with that abstraction. So it's going to show you the failure mode that corresponds to the way you taught. Can you learn from that failure mode to improve? Or can we show you the answer for a different task and have you generalize that to the original task at hand? And so first, no, most people don't provide abstractions, let alone sufficient abstractions. Second, if we try to induce people by giving them a ridiculous number of times that they have to repeat teaching the same things, most people still don't actually resort to using abstractions or figure out the sufficient abstraction that they might use. And multitask settings also don't seem to do this. And then third, debug demo maybe helps some people, but actually for a lot of people we found that they were so confused by seeing the robot fail that it made them worse at teaching the abstraction. The analog video also seemed to not help, so people were having a hard time translating the knowledge from teaching in one task to another. And it wasn't until they saw an expert do the abstraction teaching that they were able to get it. And so participants do not naturally use these abstractions, contrary to some indications from prior work. And even when they do, they may not be the correct abstractions. That the only medium that really helped was actually showing the answer to the person. And there's a diversity, equity, and inclusion problem that I think I want to call out, is that we had a proxy IQ metric. So we're not certified psychologists who can actually do an IQ test, but there's an online psychometrics project where they're trying to develop something that's a proxy for an IQ test that we administered after the experiment. And we found that the abstraction scores that people provided in their demonstration was correlated with your IQ. And so we actually got pushback from some people in the HRI community saying that perhaps you shouldn't be looking at that. That's a concerning finding. And so we actually published it in RSS. And kind of my position on this is actually like, if this is a real thing, this is impacting the ability to have everyone benefit from robots. And so if it is a real phenomenon, we need to note that it exists and then figure out what is the right user interface or training methods so that everyone, regardless of your IQ or this proxy of basically puzzle solving, can benefit from this technology. And ultimately, hopefully, we're going to be, so Aaron Hedlund and Nina Moorman have already done studies with user populations, looking at learning in the home with real people as part of the cognitive empowerment program at Emory University. Works under peer review. So sometime later today, I'll be helping her with rebuttals, so that'll be fun. So how do we close the loop? I've shared with you a little bit in reciprocal mind meld how that might work. But I'm going to now talk about explainable artificial intelligence briefly as I somewhat come to a close in my talk. that another facet of learning from demonstration is that we don't just have heterogeneity or suboptimality, we also have diversity in the way people like things done, not just preferences, but also different heuristics that we adopt. Work 3 decades ago tried to get commercial line pilots to provide data for the same flight plan and use a decision tree to come up with an autopilot based upon that data. And the commercial line pilots so disagreed in the way to execute that flight plan that they found it was better to train a decision tree on just one pilot's data than lumping it together. That's not a scalable approach. So we recently got an NIH R01 grant working with cardiac perfusionists at the VA and at the Harvard Medical School. And we had some data that we got from them. And I was actually doing this analysis myself. And what you'll see here is our model. What's this ID thing? I literally put the ID of the row in the Excel spreadsheet that we got for the tabular data for how a perfusionist would decide how to oxygenate and keep the flow of your blood properly so that you don't die during open heart surgery. We see our accuracy in predicting what the perfusionist would do. We got a 7% jump in performance just by putting the row ID in the model, and it's like, what? Why should that matter? Well, I had a hunch that it might matter, and I asked our perfusionist partners about this, and I said, did you get this data from multiple different people? And they're like, yeah, how'd you know? I'm like, because they're different. They think differently, and they're at the same institution practicing together. If you don't account for this, not only do you get a hit, but you also have to realize that there's not necessarily a gold standard in care. There's definitely not a gold standard in a lot of healthcare domains. People are doing their best and they're very smart. But we have a long way to go before we can write down an actual reward function that says, here's the knob setting I need here so that you die 70 years from now a very happy person. Connecting that is really, really difficult. But on the way to get there, I want to at least be able to learn from heterogeneity. And so either I can learn a model for each individual perfusionist, or I can cluster them and then learn within each cluster of perfusionists and pool their data to help fight the curse of dimensionality to be more data efficient. But the objective for clustering and the objective for inverse reinforcement learning are different objectives. And so the clustering you get might not actually be good for IRL. But what if you could do variational inference and learn in some embedding space the way in which each individual person is different from the typical or prototypical or maximally bland decision maker? To be able to tease this out. And how can we explain then to the perfusionist why the model is right or what it's learned about you? This is Brad Hayes' joke from Colorado. Why did the neural network cross the road? I don't know, but look, it did really well. A lot of people, that's all they care about. But every time I go to the Navy, to healthcare, they want their linear regression. A decision tree scares them. So we're a long way from having these neural networks actually gain support of these practitioners. And so we developed personalized neural trees, it's basically a fuzzy tree. So we replace the decision nodes of each in the tree with a sigmoid to get a degree of truth. And then we can have the leaves be a probability distribution over actions or labels. Then we can do backprop over this. And we're going to have an embedding vector that characterizes your heterogeneity. And then we're also going to have this psi, C. Lester Sue and I were talking earlier about Greek, so I need to, I think, brush up on my pronunciation. To be able to, if you can regularize those feature selector terms, then you can actually get out an exact Boolean tree at the end of the day. So you can literally tell somebody, here's how you simulate what I think about your decision making. And the heterogeneity matters because if you lump this data together, if people like to pass on the left, people pass on the right, if you're not careful and you average it, you're going to crash into the car in front of you. So we employed these variational techniques to be able to tease out the person-specific components of the variance, extract out the decision tree through our regularization process. And when we evaluated that on a set of planning and decision-making tasks, we found that our method was able to outperform prior work that looked at clustering or not, and for example, InfoGale. I think there's something very special about the neural tree architecture that's available for planning and scheduling type tasks. And then when we regularize it, We also are still outperforming many of the non-interpretable baselines, except for one example, when we actually found it was better to take our model, extract state action pairs from the rollout and the embeddings we learned, and then to separately train a supervised learning algorithm, or CART C4.5 to get a decision tree. But in general, I don't think that's a good approach. I'm going to argue that you need to optimize the interpretable representation itself. Let's say we have a deep reinforcement learning algorithm trained on cartpool. Many of you might have done this in this room. You're going to get state action pairs that are kind of the rollouts of the neural network executing this task. And then I'm going to take that batch data set offline and train a decision tree to mimic the neural network. If I do that and then I use that decision tree to control the cartpool, it will suck horribly because of the covariance shift issues that we get in behavior cloning. Instead, if you actually directly do backprop over the decision tree, the differentiable form with the regularization, not only do you get a interpretable representation of your policy, it's also high performing as a policy itself. So you need to align the explainable model itself with the optimization that you're trying to perform. But is XAI actually useful, subjectively and objectively? Particularly because so many people are really interested in this. And so very briefly, we have a journal paper that just came out where we looked at various forms of explanation in a common sense reasoning task, looking at posing, say Mark has just started running and is trying to train for a local marathon. The marathon is set to take place in a month, so Mark has been training very hard. Unfortunately, a week before the marathon, Mark suffered an injury. What did he injure? His elbow, neck, knee, or back. A robot can offer suggestions, provide some explanation according to one of these formats, and then we can measure whether or not you accept the robot's advice or reject it, and then how much you agree with it. And we found that the right form of explainability, it's not that one form of explainability fits everyone, but if you look at the subjective rating of explainability we get from subjects, and then how many answers that they get correctly, there is a weak but statistically significant correlation between explainability and correct decision making when working with robotic decision support, which is very promising for the use of this. We've also looked at explainability in human-machine teaming in a NeurIPS paper by Rohan Paleja. We had in Minecraft a human and an AI agent work together to collaboratively build a house. We looked at Micah Inslee's 3 levels of situational awareness and how explainable AI may enhance that. And we found that using a situational awareness global assessment technique where you blank out the screen and then ask people what was happening and what will happen in the future, that for level 2 comprehension of the current state of the environment and level 3 being able to project into the future, having full decision trees improves your situational awareness. That's great if you're wanting to team with an agent that you've never worked with before. But if you're actually having to spend all that time reading the decision tree while trying to play the game, you actually lose performance. And so we argue that explainable AI can help build shared mental models quickly in ad hoc teaming settings before you then go and team. And then hopefully you can then use what you've learned kind of in the briefing room before you go and play, then how the system will work. I'd like to point you to a paper by Mariah Schrum. We have a journal paper coming out version of this. We take trying to improve the rigor of HRI. We take that seriously. And with particularly the design of subjective questionnaires, there's a lot of suboptimal practices that we'd like to kind of try to address in our community. And if you want to ever get into that research, I'll point you to that paper. Basically, you see so much red because that's a quantification of all the bad, unfortunately, across the last 4 years. I'm going to tease that we do a lot of work in coordinated reasoning for manufacturing, particularly for learning from people, learning models of people as they get better at the tasks that they're doing. In seasonal manufacturing and gig economies, this is very important. It takes 6 months for a person or for a manufacturing line to get fully up to speed. And so we've been looking at characterizing the learning curves of individuals working within a human-machine team so that a robot can then figure out how to explore or exploit your competencies within a task planning and scheduling framework, and showing that actually people like the more exploration the robot does to learn what they're best at. And more work there. And with that, I think humans are amazing. And I would be happy to take any questions as I tease the cool new thing that I will do in the future. Thank you.
Thanks for a great talk. When you were teaching people, you were seeing whether they use abstractions while teaching. How did you convince them that the robot could actually deal with being taught using abstractions?
How did we, is the question, how did we convince people that the robot could be taught with abstractions?
Yes. How did you give them the idea that that was even something that they could be doing and that the robot would get it?
Yeah, we had to very carefully think about how do we not just give people the answer, but still give them the opportunity to figure it out. And because some people did figure it out on their own, we think that the interface was at least sufficient to afford that. So we tried to build in affordances into our graphic user interface that would allow people, so you could see, here's like the recipes that you could make. You could copy paste them and reuse them in different ways across different days to do different things. And some people just chose not to take advantage of that, even though we did provide a training video that showed the basic functionality of the interface. Some people just really wanted to teach the whole thing end to end.
Thanks. Any other questions?
It was interesting to see that you clearly saw different strategies that people took when solving tasks. What do you think is a problem? Do we lack representational capacities in our RL policies that kind of fail to learn it? Or is it the learning process itself that causes the collapse and actually the representational capacity is fine as long as the learning process could have accommodated that? Because of course we see this recurring many, many times, and actually it would be beneficial to have a policy that could actually, go into one mode or the other mode because maybe something in the environment changes slightly and makes one of the, behaviors more appropriate for a particular environment. And so you showed that we even maybe have it in the human data, but we kind of are really struggling to make use of it, maybe.
Yeah, are you talking about this work?
Yeah, but I mean in general, when you showed clustering and all this stuff, right? It's very clear that it would be nice to be able to, instead of, it's basically collapsing to the mean because you have, taking a mean of all this data, right? And clearly something is difficult. Is it that the policies that we, tend to, mostly of them are Gaussians and maybe they lack ability to sort of be able to be conditioned on something and pick one mode versus the other mode? Or is it the training procedure itself that is making it difficult to train in such a way that you would have this multimodal policy that can switch depending on the
Yeah, so people in RL are also looking at this multimodality. So the question being why is this happening? Why do we have to explicitly address it? There's a few issues. One, that there's a latent variable that we're not accounting for in our state space. In this case, I'm saying it's some person-specific factor. And so I'm going to try to infer that from your demonstration so that I can explain how in the same state, two different people are doing different things. A neural network can't figure that out unless it has some capacity to reason about a latent variable. The other one is that neural networks are lazy, and with the regularization techniques we do, they're going to overfit to the most common thing and just prioritize that in mode collapse. So I say it's very similar to the problems that people have in GANs with mode collapse. Inherently, and then also explicitly that there's latent variables that we're trying to tease out.
If it's okay, can I get in one last question? Or we have to get kicked out? Okay, maybe we might be out of time. Okay, so, all right, we'll end here. Please come up, and if you have additional questions for Matthew, go ahead and ask him. And thanks again for the great talk, Matthew.
Yeah, thank you.